The word discipleship is not even found in the New Testament. What is it, and how do you do it? And do we even need it? Well, let's talk about it on an all-new episode of C28. I think we got a good discussion for today. It's a question that was asked by one of our listeners, and we thought it'd be cool to talk about it. It's the topic of discipleship. And so I asked two people to join me. One is Dani Wood and one is Tom Menley, both of which for various reasons have brought up the idea of discipleship in various ways. And I'll just say in what ways. So Dani has brought up, she works in the nursery at our church here, and she has brought up having some intentional time with these kids, even when they're super young, where a lot of times we typically just kind of ditch the kids off, take a breath, and allow those parents to go in without the kids. But Dani, being in there with those kids, is thinking, let's utilize that time, even with songs that teach them about who Jesus is. And so in my mind, I was thinking she has this idea of discipleship in her head, even for these young ones. And Tom has taken it upon himself to intentionally, I think, kind of having prayerfully considered and received a conviction about it, to engage the old and young men in our church and just make connections with them. And as discipleship is seen and received, taking on those, and to the point where it's turned into where, I mean, in my mind, you have like 5 meetings every single morning, starting at 4 a.m., go until whatever time in the morning, just because that's when these people are available. And so you both have shown that you guys have this desire and see the need in being intentional about discipleship. So I thought, if I'm going to talk about it, bring you guys in and let you guys kind of carry that conversation. But as we get started, why don't you take a moment, each of you, just introduce yourself so our listeners can kind of get to know you a little bit.
Okay, I'm Dani Wood. My career was in teaching in a homeschooling environment, so I would visit families, and I really feel like I did a lot of discipleship in that role as a teacher. Whatever the real true meaning of the word is, we're going to talk about that some more. But my job was very relational, and I loved that part of it. I've been in Ione for about 6 years, and my husband and I live here in Ione in town, and we love it. We love Cornerstone, and we're just happy to be here.
And my name is Tom Menley. I've been in the county about, since third grade. I worked at a correctional facility here at Pine Grove and in Pine Grove Camp. And I spent my 30 years basically talking to guys, and I've just developed a technique to talk to them. And so as I retired, I just continued that with guys, and it just developed into, discipleship. So I've enjoyed that time and look forward to much more of that. Yeah.
So to start the conversation off, super simple, super foundational. Is it true that we've all heard phrases like being discipled or discipling someone or making disciples? Like, we've heard those phrases, right? Mm-hmm. So the question that we were talking about today is, what is discipleship? And then the second part of that, always the practical side of it, is, do I need it? Because maybe there is this discipleship thing that's happening, just some people need it, or we don't need it. And arguably it could be super important as well. So it'd be worth the conversation. Maybe I'll just start off here with, the word discipleship is actually not found in the New Testament. Disciple is, obviously, but this discipleship is not. You guys want to talk around a little bit about maybe what the difference between disciple and discipleship is, or even definition, like a working definition for discipleship?
I would look at discipleship just from the standpoint of you're doing life together. And so it's just meeting with one another and beginning to take time to be intentional about your relationships and talking about the Lord in that fashion. So, my goals always in discipleship is to get someone that's excited about being in the Word and get them excited about it and meet with them on a regular basis. And we meet, since COVID, I started doing Zoom, and it just turned into doing Bible studies on Zoom. And so it turned into meet with guys 4 or 5 days a week. And so that consistentality really works well because they're in the Word every day and we have conversations every day. And it's been really, really good. So the discipleship is, from my standpoint, it's just doing life together.
What about you, Dani? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think that we all need to be discipled, if we're using that term. All of us can be at any time in our lives. Some of us maybe need it more than others at different times in our lives. And I also think that there is definitely a difference between discipleship and just spending time with people. I believe that discipleship is more purposeful, that you, because of your relationship with Jesus, then you're reaching out on that level to help and draw other people closer to Jesus, like Tom was talking about.
Yeah, you're saying there's maybe a difference between like spending time with other Christians, maybe more side of fellowship and even one-on-one, but discipleship has some intentionality behind it.
Yes.
Yeah, no, good point.
I think there's different levels of discipleship, honestly, because I think it all works together. Small groups are they're vital, they're important, but they're once a week type of thing. And so it's a good time to connect and fellowship and be discipled. But then there's another level to that you're meeting more often and more intentional. And it's typically one-on-one where it's more intimate and you're able to get to much deeper levels of conversation.
Yeah. Well, although discipleship isn't used, oh my goodness, faux pas. Sorry, I didn't silence my device. I apologize. All right, so although discipleship is not used in the New Testament, disciple is. And so obviously there's a root word there. So let's look at that for a second. So the Greek word used for disciple is mathetes, which means learner. The root word of disciple is math, right, which means mental. And so the word literally means learner, and within its context, a disciple of another who is one who learns his ways and follows. So there are other words that talk about teaching and kind of like the intellectual learning, but if you were to use the word disciple in the New Testament, there would have, within its context, had a connotation of following also, not just intellect. And so the disciple is somebody who looks at somebody, typically in that context would have been a rabbi or some other leader, and they would follow and learn from them. And their goal was to be kind of more like that rabbi. They believe this rabbi knows the way, he knows the truth, and I want to learn and be like him and have my life slowly transformed into that. So it would have been this learning and following together. That word discipleship in Matthew is used 72 times, in Mark 76 times, in Luke 37 times, altogether in the New Testament 263 times. So I would argue not only is that word used, but it's used a lot.
Yeah.
And it's this idea of like learning, this growing, and this following. And so what's interesting is the difference between disciple and discipleship could be something like a verb and a noun. A disciple is a thing, maybe, like that is a disciple of Jesus, meaning he is one of those things that follow Jesus and learn from Jesus. And then there's disciple as more as a verb, which I think probably our conversation will surround, and that's the action of learning and growing, and I'm a disciple of them. Or discipleship is the action of walking along beside somebody in that process. But I'll go to Matthew here, chapter 28, verses 19 through 20. We will notice the Great Commission. It says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit." And then it goes on to say, "Teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. And behold, I am with you always till the end of the age." So make disciples, make the noun, make the thing, these people that are converted and now are going to be following Jesus. And then later, it even explains and works out what we would call as discipleship then, like the verb, teaching them to deserve all that I've commanded you. And as I think both of you guys have mentioned, there's a relational component to this discipleship. And some would call it maybe like the kind of coming more arm in arm and walking with that person in that learning, rather than what some would call preacher, which is just kind of the teaching, exegeting the text, hermeneutics, homiletics, and then allowing the Holy Spirit to work within that and working out the applications. Where this discipleship has this more relational component, small group, valid option, but also maybe more one-on-one or something like that. So what are you guys' thoughts on that? Am I hitting anything there?
No, I think that's good. It's a good point. The small groups are very valid and important, but the one-on-one is where you kind of come alongside someone and you're just walking with them. And a lot of times it's mainly allowing them to talk and listen to their own verbiage, their own thoughts, and then you interject a question or two here and there, and you're just walking along. And it's a slow process, but it is exciting to see someone that gets excited about the word, begins to grow, and really can take that on. And then the other thing is getting them to understand that it's not simply knowledge; it's applying that scripture. It's your desires to please God is higher than your desires to please yourself, type of thing. So you decrease and Christ increases in you. And so when that takes place, that's super exciting to see someone that gets there and kind of catches it. And most of the guys I work with, they're all busy guys. They have families and they're very active in their families with their kids. And it's hard for them to meet on a full-time basis. But they see the importance and the value of it. And so I look for a guy that has that heart and that desire. And then I just kind of come alongside them, walk with them, and do life together, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you think, Dani?
Well, I absolutely agree with everything that Tom has to say, but in the context that you kind of brought me in on was the working with children. And, you're never going to be in an environment where more real life happens, really, I think, than in a nursery setting where, kids are going to just knock somebody's block off and just look at you like, yeah, what are you going to do about it? And so there's that constant modeling of proper behavior and just teaching them how to respond. And we kind of go through a little thing. Most of the nursery workers are kind of on board with this now, where we say, you don't just get to say sorry. You have to say, sorry, I hit you with the stick. And then we don't have sticks in the nursery, but that's just
that's a good point.
That's aside. But
it's wild.
And then then there's a response given when they're ready for it to say, I forgive you. And many of the children are saying that when we have a little altercation in the nursery. But we're just modeling, soft speaking but firmness. And that's one of the things that I had in my notes was just the idea that in discipleship that you're not only just being nice and fun and everything's all fuzzy and warm, there's also some discipline in there. And sometimes when you reach that point in the relationship where you are allowed to speak into someone's life honestly, then sometimes there's truth and hard things to talk about.
Yeah. John Piper brings up that within discipleship, he is absolutely convinced that the word no is used. And that in times in discipleship, it's teaching them the truth, helping assist them in that and walking with them in that. But also there's times where we say, yes, go do that. Or sometimes we grab the collar of the shirt and we're like, hey, let's talk about this for a second, right? And that's kind of more that life part where just having the information in your head sometimes actually it is possible, I'll say it this way, it is possible to have all the right information in your head, but not to have that work its way out in your own life. In discipleship, because we're human beings, we can look and we can see what's going into somebody's head and is it working its way out, and we can kind of encourage those things in each other to have that truth become how we are as followers of Jesus. Yeah. And you're saying that it even starts in these kids' life, taking those moments to be able to explain what forgiveness looks like, what love and care looks like, and things like that.
Yeah, time out in the nursery is not a harsh thing. It's more, very often, sometimes, just come and sit on my lap for a minute, and we're going to think about this. So.
Yeah, that's good.
One thing about discipleship that I notice is that looking at church history and looking at Jonathan Edwards, who was an American evangelist, very popular, very smart, very educated guy, but he preached very well. And I also look at Charles Whitfield, and as he's over in France, and he's evangelizing, and he would get up on a rock or a table and he would speak outdoors, but he would do 30 sermons a week type of thing, and he would meet with 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 people at a time, and even at one time there was like 60,000 people. But
wow.
The point that Edwards makes is that his observation of the Great Awakening was that God does big things in these moments of a revival, a Great Awakening, or maybe a crusade like Billy Graham's. But later on in life, he realized that, yes, God does do wonderful and big things in those big moments, but he does things primarily magically or masterfully in those moments of discipleship, the one-on-ones, time together. So as just doing life together. So I really caught that and took that to heart, and trying to just be intentional about everything I do in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's amazing how much, I know we're getting a little off topic here, but it's interesting how God uses we have several missionaries that utilize soccer, you know, and it's a game, you know, it's not that even important of a game, you know, it's barely a sport. No, I'm kidding. I play soccer. That was just a joke for those who like to dog soccer, but it's amazing that God uses things like that where we see, you know, thousands of kids over the course of years, and young adults place their faith in Christ through these soccer ministries. And I think in the end, what happens is we're playing soccer, and then there's these relationships that form. And there is somebody that's teaching, but then they have their coaches, right? And they have like 12, 15 players or so, and they kind of have these relationships with these kids. And they're obviously intentional with their time to be pointing them towards Christ and doing everything with, you know, kingdom mindedness. And God works incredibly through those things. So yeah, that's a good point.
One of the things that I thought of too, and thinking about today, was the fact that really any one of us can be a discipler in people's lives. You don't have to have a college degree. You don't even have to graduate from high school or have an MDiv. You just have relationship. If you love Jesus, then you can disciple.
Yeah. Christians disciple.
I think that the mindset is that we should all have a disciple, someone that's mentoring us, and we should all be mentoring someone.
Yeah.
And that should be an ongoing thing
What's
throughout our
the
life.
danger if they don't?
If they don't,
So say there's, and I'm not trying to push anything that everybody has to have this formal discipleship relationship, but I think my value in it and is that when I have that person, I see the fruit of that, and now it makes me nervous not having that person that can look into my blind spots for me. Obviously, I have a spouse who can do that pretty well, right?
Yeah.
But it's nice to have somebody else also
Yes.
who can be doing that. And so, I mean, what are the dangers if you don't?
I think we relate in different ways. So our spouse can relate to us in one way, and we catch that. But we also can relate to someone else that from another angle that can put it in a different way. And they may be saying the same thing, but they say it in a different way. And that's real helpful. So it's important that we have that. I think, like for myself, I've had a mentor for 30 plus years, and we meet every week. And there's been times where I do all the talking, and I'm just bouncing things off of him, and he's just asking a question here and there. And then there's other times where he's doing a lot of talking. So, and there's been moments of struggles that he will engage me with, and he's willing to do that. So that's why he's my mentor, because I know he'll tell me the hard things that need to be said, and he'll confront me if that's needed, and he's done that. I'm also, you know, working in a correctional setting. I'm used to talking to guys, and so you're talking to guys with struggles, and in a institutional setting, and so that bond takes place in the middle of those struggles when you engage them and you begin to open up to them, and they open up to you, and and then you come back the next day, and it's just like another day. It's not there's no grudges, there's nothing held against them. They simply sense that you are being genuine with them. And so it's that process of mentoring and discipling. But there can be downsides to that where it is a 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It is being patient with folks. Looking at people through God's eyes and not your own eyes is another thing that I would look to. And it's easy because you can see the pattern, you know what needs to be done, and you kind of want to just go over there and here it is. But you can't do that. You have to allow them to see it and come to and allow God to work in their hearts, and it's in His time and not yours. So discipling is an ongoing thing. It's relational. It's lifelong type thing.
And you just to draw to make sure I'm drawing the right things out of this, one of the things you just mentioned there, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is this idea that we have, like within relationships, say like a marriage, there is that where they can kind of see into our blind spots. And I think that within a marriage, there should be some of the correction, rebuke, and exhorting and encouraging and all of those things that also follow in discipleship. But you kind of brought up something where you brought somebody you can look up to in a sense kind of like imitate, as in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 1, where Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And so you're kind of talking about this mentor you find that potentially maybe has a couple of years on you, like not always, but maybe has a couple of years, a little bit older than you, that you can then model after a little bit. Yeah.
That's good point.
Well, there is a question I had that I think may come up. I thought we could spend a moment on it. What's the difference between discipleship and evangelism? Because there is a word for evangelism, and it's not disciple. And so, I mean, maybe they lay over each other, or maybe they don't. Like, what are you guys' thoughts on the differences in your practical experience of evangelism versus discipleship?
I could be wrong in this, but when I think of evangelism, I think of the standing in front of a crowd and talking and teaching and exhorting people, where I think of discipleship as more like Tom has said, before, that it's one-on-one, it's relational, it's you earn the right to be in someone's life by showing you're caring for them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I thought about this a few times, where you're basically having two conversations with people in general, and one of them is evangelizing. And so now you're witnessing, you're telling the gospel, they're sharing the story of Jesus Christ to them, with the idea of to evangelize to them. And so there's that conversation. But then once someone begins to profess their faith, you're now entering into an area of mentoring and discipling, and that goes both ways. And so now it's a little bit deeper. There's a little bit more of an expectation because we are professing. So therefore, for example, I would want someone to come to me and talk to me if I'm off astray somewhere, and it may be hard to deal with and take. And I've had that happen to me where it's hard to hear it, but I know it's coming from a genuine heart and a person and so even if they deliver it wrong, I still take it, because I would much rather be corrected and brought back in line rather than to continue off in that direction. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, sure. No, that's good. So the word for evangelism actually isn't used that many times in the New Testament, which was interesting to me. There's 3 times we see it used. One's in Acts, where it says Philip the evangelist. Mm-hmm. Ephesians talks about gifts that God has left the church, and one is the evangelist. And then 1 Timothy challenges pastors and leaders and Christians to do the work of evangelists, that some would do the work of evangelism. And so this meaning, though, is of evangelism almost, and the word can be interpreted this way also, as missionary. Mm-hmm. And so the evangelist is the one who kind of is sent to go and do what Dani had said earlier. We're standing and kind of proclaiming. In fact, one of the definitions of the Greek word for evangelism is proclaim. And so, the evangelist is somebody who is kind of sent to go and bring the gospel and kind of make the disciples. And then I think discipleship still has its place in the work of a missionary's life, where then it turns into this smaller, more one-on-one, maybe small group, but has that more relational side, where the evangelist sometimes is standing on the rock, is preaching to 60,000 people, who is sent off to a place where they haven't heard the gospel, and nobody there is regularly preaching the gospel, and they go and do that. In Romans chapter 10, verses 14 through 15, it says, "How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him who they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news." And that last preach has the same root word as evangelism in it. And so I think that's a pretty neat way to differentiate, because one of the questions that came up is, what's the difference? I think the evangelist is the one who is more the missionary, the one who is sent to go. And that's a unique, special work also. Mm-hmm. And within the missionary's work, there's also discipleship, as well as in the local church that we're all, hopefully all Christians are going to be a part of. There's going to be discipleship in there. And so I came up with a working definition, and let me see if you guys can get on board with this. If not, we can twist it around a little bit. Okay. Well, this is what I wrote. It doesn't, maybe it doesn't make sense. I wrote it in the car. We'll see. Go and make disciples, which are learners and followers of Jesus. Then discipleship is the walking along the side of, in relationship, guiding the learning and the growing, all the while giving honor and submission to the work of the Holy Spirit. So let me point out a couple parts here. One is we're all supposed to go and make disciples, right? Make the ones, like bring the news that causes them, the Holy Spirit responds to them hearing the good news. They respond to it. They become disciples, learners, growers, followers of Jesus. And then discipleship is the walking along the side of them in relationship, guiding the learning and the growing. All the while, we're not taking credit. We're giving honor and submission to the work of the Holy Spirit in their life. And we just get to be we're blessed to be able to be tools of God in that process. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if somebody were wondering what it is that something, as we continue to use that word, that we can be on the same page with? Or did I miss something?
Yeah.
No, I think so.
Yeah, I think so too. So one of the things, just, when Tom was talking about a mentor that you've, in your life for years and years, I've never been one to say that I have a best friend, girlfriend, but I have a couple of girlfriends, and I call them my talk me off the ledge girlfriends, the ones that I call when I'm a mess, or I really need counsel, or, okay, this happened, and I know deep in my heart that my perspective is all wrong, and I know you're going to tell me. So here it is. Mm-hmm. And that's that kind of that correction that I get from those two relationships. And it's been painful sometimes, but really helpful in my life to have those people. I never thought of them as my mentors, but I guess they are.
Yeah, interesting.
So. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that I probably have Christian friends, like we kind of talked about earlier. I've had Christian friends that probably don't disciple me much, although I do trust them to call out major deficiencies in my behavior, but I wouldn't necessarily call them my disciplers. And so maybe an interesting spot for the listeners would be maybe thinking through which of the people have you brought along in your life or God has placed in your life. Can you identify as somebody who disciples you? And then also, is there somebody that God has convicted your heart to engage in helping disciple them? And within that, I would probably, we'll get to the verse in a second. I think it's Titus chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, where it talks about, older mentoring younger. But I like to kind of look for those, like, who are those older people, like even 10, 15, 20 years ahead of me, that I can kind of be learning from, and obviously if there's somebody who's 15 years older than me, but they've only been a Christian for 3 years, wonderful. But maybe I'd look for somebody who has, more years of following Jesus also, right? Because I assume my walk with the Lord will be substantially different in 15 years. So I'd be looking for somebody who's already learned some of those juvenile mistakes I'll make, can kind of help protect me from those. Yeah. So John Piper brings up these. Tell me what you think of this. He says, when he's discussing discipleship, he's asked the same question. He says, there's kind of two parts to discipleship. He goes, there's my discipleship and my own pattern of following Jesus, trusting him and learning from him. And then there's discipleship and my activity in helping others be disciples and learning about him and following him. And so he oscillates between that verb and noun of disciple again as well. But so he sees it part of like, I have my own discipleship where I am pursuing the Lord and following Jesus, trusting him and learning from him. And then also there's this this verb of me actively engaged in doing those things and helping other people do those things. What are you guys' thoughts on that?
Yeah, I get that. I'm looking at Jonathan Edwards, something he said, and maybe I'm taking us off a little bit track here, but
No, go for it.
But what he talks about is when the minister commits and cements himself in a place. In other words, he's committed long term, and then when the church body, is committed long term. So in other words, you become a member, and you're looking at that membership as it's a lifelong thing. It's not. It's a serious thing. It's like getting married in a sense that you're becoming a part of this church body. And so when the body cements themselves in ministry and in the body, the same way as the pastor, and then the community does the same thing. The community begins to see the genuineness, and they begin to embrace what's going on. So I'll give you an example. Where I live, there's a coffee shop, and people meet there, and we have conversations, and it's a very well-known place that people go and have conversations about the Lord and so forth. And in that time, there's a story that took place where over in the pizza parlor just down the road, a young guy was working there, employee, and he was having a really tough time, some real tough life issues. And the gal that worked there, she says, you need to go over to this coffee shop over here and just talk to them, because they will minister to you. And so he does.
Wow.
And so one of the guys here, Drew, was there, and he talked to him, and he had some really good conversations. But my point in that is that the community recognizes that. They see the church working and functioning, and so they embrace that. And so when you have all three of those things line up, you begin to see God working magically or masterfully in a discipling mode. And here in Amador County, we have lots of pastors, and I can name the names. They're committed. They're long-term committed. Some of them have been here since kids, and they go away and go to college, and they come back and minister. And they stay in the church body for 20, 30, 40 years. You look at John MacArthur and Piper and these other guys, R.C. Sproul's, who are committed for a lifelong commitment to that church. I think John MacArthur, 50 years in his church. And so when you're committed that way, you really do see some really positive, good changes, and God works there.
Yeah. Well, and I think we see, so although the word discipleship is not used in the Old Testament, I would argue, and many others argue, that we see the principle or the concept of it threaded throughout the New Testament. And just some examples here. Titus chapter 2, verses 3 through 4. That's the older women. It gives the example of the older teaching the younger and taking advantage of that. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2. You teach the word of God to people who will then teach it to others. It's this chain that you teach it and entrust it to them, who will then take it and they will entrust it to others. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4, fathers, teach your children and instruct them. And one thing, I can't remember who I was talking to about this, but, this is embarrassing. I was watching an interview between, I can't remember his name. I think it was, this is weird. I think it was William Lane Craig. I could be wrong. William Lane Craig and Kirk Cameron. And I think I clicked on it because I'm like, whoa, that's a weird setup. And anyways, they had brought up that there's a tremendous amount of discipleship that is at home. And largely, we have faithful followers of Jesus who are women spending day in and day out at home with these kids, and they're discipling their kids. And they have the pressure of, in a sense, not being able to get out of that discipleship, where, this whole imitate me as I imitate Christ type of thing. You got to be on point. And I think that there are these pressures that at home, there's a lot of discipleship happening there. Even when you're not thinking about discipling, those kids are watching you. If you're a stay-at-home dad, stay-at-home mom, or you both work from home, the parents at home, we're supposed to be discipling our kids, and they're watching us.
Yes.
And what fascinates me and worries me are the things my kids will remember, because I can look back at my childhood, and there's wonderful stories of great fishing trips that my dad took us on. He's like, I remember that time we went fishing and we caught 8 salmon, and we just couldn't even, get the hook in the water without, and I'm like, I don't remember that one. And he's like, no, or these trips we go on. And then there's times where, my parents felt like they, at times blew up on us about certain things. I'm like, I don't remember that. And so what I worry about is man, I really hope my kids remember this or remember that, but we can't really control that. So all the time, we're clocked in for discipling our kids. But anyways, So we see that in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4, Matthew 28:20, we see it, Hebrews chapter 3, verse 13, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10, we see it, Acts chapter 18, verse 24, we see it. And it's intentional. It's there. It's threaded throughout. It's part of it's part of a Christian's life, is having other people also. Part of the reason that we are warned to continue to meet together, because that's very important, is that I think we need people in our life, partly to just even be able to see our blind spots. Paul Tripp once said that you can't live your life believing that you know yourself best. Otherwise, nobody will ever be able to correct you.
That's right.
And I think for me, and that was in a marriage conference he did, but for me, I think that in my Christian life in general, I have to expect that other people know me better than even I know myself in some areas. And what that allows for is that every time, and this kind of drives Emily nuts sometimes, but every time somebody critiques me, even if it seems really outlandish, I really do take it to heart and think about it, because my initial thought is always like, is that true? And I think the person who lives their life thinking, I know myself best, can easily be like, that's not me, and throw it in the trash. Where really, maybe you don't see yourself as accurately as you think. So I think having that person in your life is important. I think that discipleship is a part, what we see in Scripture, and in these areas, it's about teaching so that the disciple can grow and learn, as the word disciple means learner. So we're providing truth, not a bunch of garbage. One of the podcasts we're looking at doing next season, we might slip it in this season, but next season is the epidemic of self-care, where everybody seems to be very about caring for myself. And if I care for myself, then I can care for others better. I just don't think that's what the Bible teaches. I don't think the Bible teaches put yourself first so that you can put other people second. And so I think that having people in your life that can kind of call those things out, right? And so as you get this deceit or this philosophy of like, care for yourself first, make yourself number one, because once you're number one, then you can really care for the number twos in your life. Somebody can your buddy can grab you by the shirt collar and shake you around and say, hey, wake up. I don't think that's the way it's supposed to work. So I think that it's about bringing in truth, because there's a bunch of deceit out there, and then being able to walk somebody along in learning that, and then also it has that practical side of living life. Is it being reflected in your life? And sometimes we know things, and that discipler in your life. So I'll give you an example. I use this one a lot. I was making jokes that were inappropriate, and I thought they were fine. And somebody told me once that I make those jokes. And what that did to my mind is that it connected my heart to my head immediately, because I knew it in my mind so as soon as he said that, I was like, oh, I shouldn't be like that. And there was that moment where I felt like a little door was opened, and like all that information just flooded into my heart. And then I began to, hate might be too strong. Maybe I wish it was that way, but I began to, like, in a sense, hate that type of humor then. And I think that what happened is that the word then penetrated my heart there. And I think God used that person's comment to do that work in my life.
Yes.
And I think that's part of, like, that person has discipled me in several ways. And so I think that that's kind of what we're looking, right?
Yes.
Knowing the truth and growing, and then getting that practical application from that life on life experience of having that person in your life.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you guys have any practical experiences yourself with that, or doing that for other people, or anything like that?
One thing I wanted to talk about and bring out is the idea of both being vulnerable. It takes two people to be willing to be vulnerable. So when you do that, and just like what you're talking about, I learned so much by talking to someone else, and as they're being kind of vulnerable back to me, and I'm sharing my life experience as well, I learn from them the questions they ask, or sometimes they say something that I'm familiar with, but yet it's said in a way that it's unique, and it really strikes me hard. And so I think having the mindset of being approachable and realizing that your life is not private. We have, everybody's looking at us, and we want them to look at us. The world is looking at us.
We're supposed to be a light.
We're a light to the world, right? And so if you treat your life as it's your walk as it's private, it's my religion, then you're not shining that light out there. So to be willing to be vulnerable, be willing to step out and sacrifice time and efforts, and it's all part of that. The other part is, I think about when you said something about missionaries, is that a missionary goes into the foreign country with the idea that they're going to work themselves out of a job, because you want them to grab a hold of the word, teach them, and so then they can now take it and go, and now you can back away and they don't need you anymore. And I think discipling is much the same way, that you are going in, you're meeting with people, but your goal is eventually you're going to establish them to where they're now going out and doing the same thing. And when you see that, then you're able to kind of back away and then start somewhere else. And that process is always working. And so I think that's healthy. That's important.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Mm-hmm. What are you thinking, Dani?
I totally agree. No, I don't have anything amazing to say about any of that. But you were asking about experiences in our lives, ourselves, and Tom talked about his mentor. And I've had women in my life who have mentored me for sure. And I've always sought people to mentor me, to be those people in my life. I remember at the church where I was in Modesto years ago, there was a woman that I really admired, and I started asking her to have breakfast with me, or just, coffee. And one time we were just sitting talking, and she said, "Why do you want to spend time with me?" It was like, because I admire you. I admire your walk and who you are and your relationship with Jesus, and I want to learn more about that. And she was kind of amazed, like, wow, so she was a really special person in my life.
Yeah. Sometimes I realize the people that were discipling me in hindsight, where they were more intentional than I'd realized. And so I think that my lead pastor that I worked with in Washington, his name is Bob Carlson, I can look back and just see like a bazillion ways he was caring for me and guiding me. I was young and dumb. I'm still that way, but just less of it. But he had his hands full with me, where I just, I was probably full of bad ideas, and he was very intentional about asking me questions, and what about this? Or like, oh, okay, no, great idea, and oh, have you thought about this? Like, what would you do in this? Oh, and he's just like, and then even down to whether it's occupationally in the sense of the ministry work I was doing, or even just my own knowledge. And I remember him calling out a couple things I was doing that wasn't like necessarily like right or wrong, but it was like insufficient. And I didn't really know till later, like the role he had in my life is, and another, so I do believe that my wife has played a big role in discipling me. And typically she really steps up her game in like tumultuous times. And so that's another one where unfortunately it's probably more in hindsight than in the moment. But I've been able to acknowledge that she's somebody who disciples me. I guess we could call her a discipleship partner as well with me. And so all the things that we've just talked about, she definitely like has fulfilled in those ways, and really major blessing in my life. And then the other one that's probably been more intentional has been I got this small group of guys. There's like 5 of us that we try to get together once a month. We read. We have like guy book clubs. I swear they're manly. They're like the most manly book clubs. Yeah. I'll tell you an example. Last time we had our book club, we had pulled pork that was like smoked for like 12 hours or something like that, and we ate pulled pork and did our study. And then the time before, we had somebody that sponsored a crab feed thing, and so they went and picked up like 8 servings of this crab feed stuff, and we just like ate crab and talk. We go camping sometimes. We went catfishing, but we do these things, and it's kind of interesting because I've realized I have to be more careful with that group because in church culture you get this cliquish thing, right? So it's interesting. We're like we kind of want people to develop tight relationships with a small group of people that you can really like. Iron sharpens iron, do life together and correct each other. But like we've just talked about, you got to be vulnerable, and I'm not going to probably be vulnerable with 40 people. And so I got this little group, and we do some things together. And for me, once a month getting together provides that formal time. And then outside of that, there's text messages and things like that. And like I said, we'll study the Bible together, or we'll read books together. We're doing this book now, real easy read, called The Men We Need. Real foundational, super, super practical. I typically am not a huge fan of those books because I feel like I'm spinning my wheels a little bit. But the practical side of it has been really helpful, and it shifts gears to the different topics really well. And it calls us to be better fathers, better disciplers, better husbands, better church leaders, like tending our garden where God has put us, tend it and work it for his glory. And it goes through all the nitty gritty stuff. And I dig that because I feel like there's this phase for me where as I've gotten older, I realize there's more and more I don't know. Like the more I learn, the more I'm like,
yes,
I don't know very much. Yeah. And so a smaller group of guys, part of our downfall is that we're all the same age. We're probably within 5 years of each other. But, we do have some other close guy friends that are a little bit older than us, and they kind of speak into our lives and stuff. But having that, I think, is really important because we do refine each other. We can call each other out.
Yes.
And I've had 3 or 4 of these guys. We have had together serious conversations about stuff. And we still love each other. We're still super tight. There's times where things feel hurtful, but yet we realize, and I think Dani brought this up, the intent and motive behind those things is like love and care and growth. And maybe starting from in the nursery, being taught like how you love each other and ask for forgiveness when you do wrong, and then you go back to doing life together. Now, life with kids apparently sticks in the nursery, but for the rest of us, we go back to work and we know like I got a good solid group of guys that if I need some correcting, they're going to do that. And if I need some encouragement, they're there too. And together we pick good material to study together. And so I think that for me, in hindsight, people like my lead pastor in Vancouver, Bob Carlson, my wife, and that small group of guys are probably my examples of that discipleship in live action in my life right now.
Yeah, I think part of, for me, what drives me is that when I was young, I didn't have anybody there to really mentor me and I kind of wish I had that. But Joel came into my life later, my late 20s, I think. And so he was able to begin to talk things into my life and speak into my heart more. And most of it with him is I realized that as I talk to him, he's asking questions because I'm one that would be very critical of myself. So you don't have to really criticize me because I can do a better job than you can. So he would recognize some of those areas. And so he would spend time encouraging and building up. But he would also he would learn to know when to say something that needs to be exhorted. And so that relationship, when you develop that, that's really good. So when I look at church ministry in general, circles of friendship, my goal is to always move that friendship circle, like bring people into that circle always. So I'm always looking at meeting guys once a week or twice, and just consistently just have a cup of coffee with them. And sometimes it goes somewhere deeper and other times it doesn't. But either way, we spend time in prayer. We spend time getting to know each other. So when we see each other in church, we have that connection. So there's that part of it that's always growing. And so my goal is to meet with every guy in the church, which will, if we grow, it never happens. And so then there's that intimate side, that there's those closer circles of friends that speak into your life. So I think you need both of those and that mindset to have, to be looking at that.
Yeah. All right. Well, Dani, in a second, do me a favor. Maybe in a couple sentences, summarize in general what discipleship is and your thoughts on whether Christians should be engaged in it or not. So as you're thinking about that, I did want to say a couple things. One is we got some really good podcasts coming up for those of you who have subscribed and listened to these things. If you got sent this link to listen to it, maybe go to our Facebook page or YouTube platform or Apple Podcasts and all those things. One's coming up that deals with parenting. We also have we're working through doing a little small series on cultural topics. That would be things that are practical, boots on the ground, things that are currently going on within our culture and within the world that maybe we need to address as Christians, and things like that. And we got, I think, 5 more episodes this season that really hone in and stay on the theology topics, such as discipleship. But that next season, we're looking at doing some of those cultural things, more of those boots on the ground, practical conversations. And obviously, that will lend itself to a lot of theology talk as we decide and talk about how Christians navigate those things. So that is what is to come. And also for the couple people that sponsor us to keep, decent mics and fixing our cables and things like that when they break. Thank you for your support. Really appreciate that. And then to wrap up this podcast, Dani, take us away and talk to us a little bit about discipleship.
Okay. Can you pose that question again?
Yeah. So the question would be, what is discipleship? And if you want, I can just read our working definition. And then should Christians be involved in it, and essentially why?
Okay. So absolutely, Christians should be involved in it. And the reason why is because from where I stand, that it's the way that we relate to each other. And God calls us to a fellowship of believers. That's there in the Word. And so in the definition part of it, I think we've covered it pretty well. But for myself, it just goes to, I need to be secure and seeking the Lord in my own walk before really I can disciple anyone else.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And then in seeking to disciple someone, it's not about me. It's about how my walk might influence their lives or draw them in so that they want that too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wonderful. Well, good work. It looks like we hit that time limit perfectly. We didn't go over. So if you're driving to work or you are maybe at home finding a break or whatever it is, thanks for joining us and discussing these things, and we will see you next time.